The reign of Louis XIV, spanning from 1643 to 1715, represents the pinnacle of French absolutism. And through the lens of artificial intelligence, we can now reconstruct the lived reality of Paris during this transformative era with remarkable precision. By processing thousands of historical documents, architectural plans, contemporary accounts, and visual records, AI technology allows us to recreate the sensory experience of walking through 17th century Paris. To understand the dramatic contrasts between splendor and squalor, to witness how absolute monarchy shaped every aspect of urban life. This reconstruction reveals a city caught between medieval decay and Baroque grandeur, where the Sun King's ambitions transformed the capital even as most Parisians struggled in conditions that had changed little since the Middle Ages. Paris, in the age of Louis XIV, was a city of approximately 500,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest urban centers in Europe, yet its physical infrastructure remained largely medieval, despite the king's grandiose building projects. The vast majority of Parisians lived in a labyrinth of ancient, narrow streets that had been laid out centuries earlier, winding passages barely wide enough for a single cart, dark canyons between buildings that rose 5 or 6 stories high and blocked out the sun for most of the day. These streets had no coherent plan or order, having grown organically over centuries as the city expanded beyond its medieval walls. Walking through them meant navigating a chaotic maze, where even longtime residents could become disoriented, where alleys dead-ended without warning, where passages suddenly narrowed to the point that 2 people could barely pass each other. The surface of these streets was a horror that assaulted all the senses simultaneously. Paving stones, where they existed, were uneven and broken, creating treacherous footing that made walking hazardous, especially at night or in wet weather. Most streets had a central gutter, an open channel running down the middle that was supposed to carry away rainwater and waste, but more often served as a stagnant repository for every imaginable form of refuse. Into this gutter flowed the contents of chamber pots thrown from windows above, the blood and entrails from butcher shops, the waste from workshops and kitchens, dead animals, spoiled food, and human excrement. The smell was overpowering, a stench so profound that foreign visitors wrote of being unable to breathe, of vomiting from the odor, of holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces in desperate attempts to filter the fetid air. Rain transformed these streets into flowing rivers of filth, the gutters overflowing and spreading their contents across the entire width of the passage, forcing pedestrians to wade through ankle-deep sewage. Wealthy individuals traveled in sedan chairs carried by porters, staying above the muck, or rode in carriages that splashed through puddles and sprayed the unfortunate pedestrians with contaminated water. The poor had no choice but to walk through it, their wooden clogs offering minimal protection, the hems of their garments soaked in filth that they could never adequately clean. In dry weather, the sun baked this waste into a dusty coating that covered everything, and the slightest breeze raised clouds of contaminated particles that people inhaled with every breath. The buildings that lined these nightmare streets were ancient structures, many dating back 2 or 3 centuries, their timber frames sagging with age, their walls bulging outward in ways that violated every principle of structural stability. The upper stories projected out over the street, each floor extending further than the one below, so that buildings on opposite sides nearly touched at their roof lines, creating dark tunnels where daylight barely penetrated even at noon. This overhang was deliberate, a way to maximize living space without paying taxes on ground-level area, but it created streets that were perpetually dim, damp, and airless. The timber and plaster construction meant that fires were a constant threat, and when they occurred, they could consume entire neighborhoods in hours, the flames leaping from building to building across the narrow gaps. Working-class Parisians lived in these buildings in conditions that defied modern comprehension of human habitation. A typical laborer's family occupied a single room, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, in a building that might house 50 or more people. This room served every function of life: sleeping, cooking, eating, working, and all other activities occurred in this tiny space. The room would contain a few pieces of crude furniture, perhaps a rough table, a couple of stools, and a wooden frame that served as a bed, on which the entire family slept together under whatever threadbare blankets they possessed. There was no privacy, no personal space, no possibility of solitude or quiet. Every sound, smell, and activity of one's neighbors penetrated the thin walls. Light came from a single small window, often without glass, covered instead with oiled paper or cloth, that admitted some light while keeping out the worst of the weather. When this covering was in place, the room was dim, even at midday, forcing people to work by feel or to open the window and endure the cold and smells from outside. Candles and oil lamps were expensive luxuries that working families used sparingly, if at all, so winter evenings were spent in near total darkness, people going to bed shortly after sunset, because there was nothing else they could do. The air in these rooms was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, chamber pots that were emptied only once or twice a day, cooking odors, and the various smells of whatever trade the family practiced. Heating was another constant challenge that shaped daily life in profound ways. Each room might have a small fireplace or brazier, but firewood was expensive, beyond the means of many families for regular use. People burned whatever they could find or afford: wood scraps from workshops, charcoal when they could get it, dried dung, even bones and refuse. The smoke from these fires had no proper ventilation, filling the rooms and corridors with acrid fumes that blackened the walls and ceilings and filled people's lungs. Chronic respiratory problems were nearly universal among the poor, a constant cough being so common that it was barely remarked upon. In winter, families huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, piling on whatever blankets and rags they possessed, and still shivering through the long nights. Water was perhaps the most pressing daily concern for ordinary Parisians, requiring hours of labor each day simply to meet basic needs. The city had public fountains scattered throughout, but they were unevenly distributed, with some neighborhoods having ready access, while others required long walks to reach the nearest source. These fountains flowed only at certain hours, and when they did, long lines formed immediately, women and children waiting their turn to fill buckets and jugs. The water itself came from the Seine, or from springs outside the city, carried by aqueducts that were ancient and poorly maintained. The quality varied tremendously, from relatively clean spring water to Seine water that was visibly contaminated with sewage, industrial waste, and decomposing matter. Hauling water was backbreaking work that fell primarily to women and children, who made multiple trips daily, carrying heavy buckets that strained their backs and shoulders. A family might need 20 or 30 gallons of water per day for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing, requiring 10 or more trips to the fountain. This water had to be carefully conserved, used first for drinking and cooking, then for washing, then finally thrown out into the street to join the general flow of filth. The idea of bathing regularly was absurd to people who struggled to obtain enough water for essential needs, and most working-class Parisians went weeks or months without washing their entire bodies. The resulting body odor was universal and unremarked, simply part of the background smell of humanity. The working people of Paris labored in conditions that ground them down physically and spiritually over the course of their short lives. Artisans worked in small workshops that were cramped, poorly lit, and inadequately ventilated, spending 12 to 16 hours a day at their trades. A carpenter worked in a shop filled with sawdust that coated his lungs. A metal worker breathed fumes from his forge. A textile worker inhaled fibers that would eventually destroy his breathing. Apprentices, often children as young as 7 or 8, worked alongside masters, learning trades through years of repetitive labor that offered no education beyond the specific skills. required for their craft. These children rose before dawn, worked until after dark, and collapsed into sleep only to repeat the cycle the next day. Women's work was equally exhausting and even more poorly compensated. Seamstresses sewed by dim light until their eyes failed, their backs permanently bent from hunching over their work. Laundresses spent their days standing in the Seine, regardless of weather, pounding clothes against stones, their hands cracked and bleeding from constant immersion in cold water and harsh soaps made from lye. Domestic servants, perhaps the largest category of female workers, lived in the attics of wealthy households, working from before dawn until late at night, subject to the whims and often the sexual predation of their employers, with no legal protection or recourse. Street vendors, another common occupation for women, walked miles each day carrying heavy baskets of goods, calling out their wares in voices that grew hoarse from constant use. The food that sustained working-class Parisians was monotonous and barely adequate for the physical labor they performed. Bread formed the foundation of every meal, a coarse, dark loaf made from a mixture of grains that was cheaper than pure wheat bread, but also less nutritious and harder to digest. A working man might consume 2 pounds of bread per day, a woman and children proportionally less, making bread prices the single most important economic factor in their lives. When bread prices rose, as they did periodically due to poor harvests or speculation, families faced genuine hunger. The rest of the diet consisted of whatever could be obtained cheaply: thin soup made from vegetables and scraps, occasional cheese, dried herring, or other preserved fish, and very rarely a bit of meat, usually pork or mutton of the cheapest quality. Cooking was done over small fires in the cramped living spaces, women preparing simple stews or soups that could stretch ingredients and cook slowly while they worked at other tasks. The lack of refrigeration meant that food spoiled quickly, especially in summer, and people regularly ate things that were partially spoiled because they could not afford to waste anything. Food poisoning was common, another hazard of daily life that people endured without medical treatment, either recovering on their own or dying if the poisoning was severe. The diet was so deficient in nutrients that diseases related to malnutrition were endemic. Scurvy from lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, rickets in children from insufficient sunlight and poor nutrition, and general weakness that made people vulnerable to every passing illness. Disease was a constant presence in working-class neighborhoods, striking with terrifying regularity and devastating effect. Plague had visited Paris repeatedly throughout the 17th century, though it became less frequent as the century progressed, the last major outbreak occurring in 1668. But even without plague, disease claimed lives constantly. Typhus spread through the crowded, filthy conditions, causing high fevers and often death. Smallpox was endemic, killing some victims and leaving survivors badly scarred, often blinded. Tuberculosis was perhaps the most common killer, a slow, wasting disease that consumed victims over months or years, their constant coughing spreading the infection to family members crowded into the same room. Dysentery, spread by contaminated water and food, killed thousands every year, particularly children whose small bodies could not withstand the dehydration. Infant and child mortality reached levels that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. Perhaps half of all children born in working-class Paris died before their 5th birthday, victims of disease, malnutrition, accidents, or simple neglect in families too overwhelmed to provide adequate care. Parents could not afford to become too attached to infants, knowing the odds of survival were poor. Births occurred at home with no medical care beyond perhaps a midwife, and many women died in childbirth or from infections afterward. Those children who survived early childhood faced countless hazards. They fell into fires, were scalded by boiling water, were trampled by horses or crushed by carts in the crowded streets, drowned in the Seine, or simply disappeared into the city's underworld of crime and prostitution. The contrast between this desperate poverty and the splendor being created elsewhere in Paris could hardly have been more stark or more deliberate. Louis XIV, styling himself the Sun King, was determined to make Paris worthy of his greatness, to create monuments and spaces that would proclaim French glory and his own magnificence to the world. The enormous resources required for these projects came from taxes that pressed heavily on the common people, who paid for the king's glory with their labor and their lives. The taille, a direct tax on commoners, took a significant portion of workers' income, while indirect taxes on salt, wine, and other necessities made everything more expensive. The contrast between the taxes extracted and the squalor in which taxpayers lived created resentment, though any open expression of discontent was dangerous. The king's building projects transformed portions of Paris into showcases of Baroque magnificence that existed in a different world from the slums where most Parisians lived. The Place des Vosges, completed earlier in the century, provided a model of planned urban space, with its elegant arcades and symmetrical design, though this beauty was reserved for the wealthy. Louis XIV expanded the Louvre Palace, adding galleries and apartments in the Italian Baroque style, covering the old fortress with classical facades that proclaimed French power and refinement. The construction employed thousands of workers who labored in dangerous conditions for minimal wages, building monuments to royal glory while living in abject poverty themselves. The king also undertook to modernize Paris's infrastructure, though these improvements touched only a fraction of the city and primarily benefited the wealthy. New streets were cut through ancient neighborhoods, creating broad avenues that allowed carriages to pass, and provided sight lines that emphasized important buildings. The Cours la Reine, a promenade along the Seine, offered wealthy Parisians a place to see and be seen, to display their carriages and fashions. Streetlights were installed on major thoroughfares, making these routes safer at night, though the narrow alleys where most people lived remained as dark and dangerous as ever. These improvements were concentrated in fashionable western districts, while eastern working-class neighborhoods saw little benefit and sometimes suffered as buildings were demolished to make way for royal projects, displacing residents who had nowhere to go. The greatest of Louis XIV's projects, however, was not in Paris, but at Versailles, the enormous palace complex he built outside the city, where he moved his court in 1682. The construction of Versailles consumed staggering amounts of money and labor, employing tens of thousands of workers who drained swamps, moved earth, built palaces and gardens, and created a monument to absolutism that would inspire and horrify observers for centuries. The decision to move the court to Versailles diminished Paris's political importance, though the city remained the economic and cultural center of France. For working Parisians, the king's absence was felt primarily in the diversion of resources to Versailles that might otherwise have improved conditions in the capital. The streets of absolutist Paris were theater for the display of social hierarchy, every aspect of dress and behavior communicating one's place in the rigid order. The wealthy traveled in elaborate carriages, the panels painted with family coats of arms, the interiors lined with silk and velvet, carried by teams of fine horses. The very wealthy had running footmen who trotted alongside the carriage, their livery proclaiming their master's status. Those slightly less wealthy used sedan chairs, enclosed boxes carried on poles by two chairmen, who navigated the narrow streets more easily than carriages. The middling sort walked, but dressed in ways that distinguished them from the poor: better cloth, cleaner garments, shoes rather than wooden clogs, wigs, or at least well-groomed hair. The poor were immediately identifiable by their clothing, which marked them as surely as a brand. Working men wore rough trousers or breeches, coarse shirts, and loose smocks or jackets designed for labor rather than appearance. Wooden clogs protected their feet, though many went barefoot in warm weather to save wear on their shoes. Women wore simple dresses of rough cloth, their hems permanently stained with the filth of the streets, aprons for work, and simple caps covering their hair. This clothing was rarely changed, washed only occasionally, and worn until it literally fell apart. The poor wore the same garments for work and sleep, removing their outer layers at most. so that their clothes became saturated with sweat, dirt, and the smells of their trades. Fashion among the wealthy reached extraordinary levels of elaboration during Louis XIV's reign, the king himself setting standards that others struggled to emulate. Men wore enormous wigs of curled hair, sometimes 2 or 3 feet high, powdered white or gray, that required constant maintenance by skilled wig makers. Their coats were embroidered with gold or silver thread, festooned with ribbons and lace, cut from silks and velvets in colors that announced wealth and status. Women's fashion was equally elaborate, with structured gowns requiring multiple layers, hoops and panniers to extend the skirts, elaborate hairstyles decorated with jewels and feathers, and cosmetics applied so thickly they created mask-like faces. The cost of a single fashionable outfit could feed a working family for a year, a fact that did not escape notice and bred resentment among those who struggled for bread. The social spaces of Paris were rigidly segregated by class in ways that were enforced by both law and custom. Wealthy Parisians socialized in salons, private gatherings in elegant townhouses, where conversation, music, and refined entertainment occupied the leisure hours of those who did not need to work for survival. They attended the theater, where special boxes were reserved for the nobility and tickets for the parterre, the standing area in front of the stage, were the only option accessible to workers who could rarely afford even these. Churches provided one of the few spaces where all classes mingled, though even here separation was maintained, with the wealthy occupying pews at the front, while the poor stood at the back or inside aisles. Taverns and cabarets served as the primary social spaces for working people, places where men gathered after work to drink cheap wine, talk, and temporarily escape the misery of their daily lives. These establishments were dark, smoky rooms, with rough tables and benches, serving wine that was often adulterated or watered down, sometimes accompanied by simple food. Here workers complained about wages and working conditions, shared news and gossip, and formed the informal networks that were their only defense against exploitation and hardship. The authorities viewed these gatherings with suspicion, seeing in them potential for conspiracy and disorder, and informers were common, reporting on conversations that might indicate dangerous discontent. Crime was endemic in working-class Paris, driven by desperation and opportunity in equal measure. Pickpockets worked the crowded streets and markets, their nimble fingers lifting purses and valuables from distracted victims. Burglars broke into homes and shops at night, taking whatever they could sell. Prostitution was widespread, women and girls selling their bodies as the only way to survive when other opportunities failed, walking the streets or working in brothels that existed in a gray area of semi-legality. The authorities made periodic efforts to suppress prostitution, arresting women and sending them to hospitals or convents for moral reform. But the underlying conditions that drove women to prostitution remained unchanged, so the practice continued. Violent crime was also common, the result of poverty, alcohol, and the ready availability of weapons. Men carried knives as tools, but also used them in fights that erupted over insults, disputes, or simple drunken aggression. The narrow streets and dark alleys provided perfect settings for robbery and assault, victims having little chance of help in spaces where cries for aid went unheard or unheeded. The authorities maintained a police force, the lieutenancy of police having been established in 1667, but it was small and focused primarily on maintaining order and enforcing regulations rather than solving crimes or protecting ordinary people. Justice was harsh when administered, with public executions at the Place de Grève, providing spectacles that drew large crowds to watch criminals hanged, broken on the wheel, or otherwise dispatched. The absolutist state inserted itself into daily life in countless ways, regulating, taxing, and controlling activities that in other times or places might have been considered private matters. Guilds controlled almost every trade, strict organizations that determined who could practice a craft, how many apprentices could be trained, what techniques could be used, and what prices could be charged. Becoming a master in a guild required years of apprenticeship, production of a masterpiece to demonstrate skill, and payment of substantial fees that put master status beyond the reach of most workers, who remained journeymen their entire lives. These guilds claimed to maintain quality and to protect workers, but in practice, they primarily benefited masters and restricted competition, making it difficult for workers to improve their situations. The state also regulated food markets, setting times and places where goods could be sold, inspecting weights and measures, and attempting to ensure adequate supplies and fair prices. Market women, who sold produce, eggs, cheese, and other goods, formed their own tight communities, defending their positions against newcomers and maintaining traditional practices. The authorities viewed these women with suspicion, seeing in their economic independence and collective power a potential threat to order. During the revolution a century later, it would be these market women who played crucial roles in popular mobilizations, their experience of organization and collective action providing foundation for political activism. Religion permeated every aspect of life in absolutist Paris, the Catholic Church being not just a spiritual authority, but also a major economic and political power. Churches and monasteries owned substantial property throughout the city, deriving income from rents while providing minimal services to the poor. The parish church was the center of neighborhood life, where births were recorded, marriages celebrated, and funerals held. The church calendar structured the year, with numerous saints' days and religious festivals breaking up the routine of work with mandatory rest and celebration. For working people, these holy days provided essential breaks from labor, though they also meant lost wages for those paid by the day. The church preached acceptance of the social order as divinely ordained, teaching that the poor should accept their lot as God's will, and that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. This message was reinforced from pulpits throughout the city, priests telling congregations that rebellion against authority was rebellion against God, that the king ruled by divine right, and that social hierarchy reflected heavenly order. This religious justification of absolutism and inequality helped maintain the system, giving the poor a framework for understanding their suffering that made acceptance, rather than resistance, seem the proper response. Yet this same church provided the only social services that existed: hospitals for the sick, hospices for orphans, and distribution of alms to the deserving poor, though these services were inadequate to the vast need. The contrast between church wealth and the poverty of parishioners did not escape notice, creating resentments that would explode during the revolution. Working people saw churches decorated with gold and silver, priests wearing fine vestments, monasteries with extensive gardens and comfortable accommodations, while they struggled for bread and lived in squalor. The church demanded tithes, taking a portion of production even from those who could barely survive on what remained. The contradiction between Christ's teachings about poverty and humility and the church's actual wealth and power created a tension that skeptics and critics exploited, though open criticism was dangerous in an age when religious orthodoxy was enforced by state power. Daily life for working-class Parisians during the Age of Absolutism was a grinding struggle for survival that offered little hope of improvement. People rose before dawn, worked until exhaustion, ate inadequate food, slept in squalid conditions, and repeated the cycle day after day, year after year, until disease, accident, or simply worn-out bodies ended lives that were rarely longer than 40 or 50 years. Those who survived to old age did so as broken shells, their bodies deformed by decades of hard labor, their health destroyed by poor nutrition and disease, dependent on charity or family support that was often grudgingly provided. Yet, people endured, creating lives and finding moments of joy and meaning, despite conditions that might seem to preclude human flourishing. Families celebrated births and marriages, mourned their dead, maintained traditions and customs that connected them to their past. Neighbors helped each other in times of crisis, sharing what little they had, caring for the sick, taking in orphans. Workers took pride in their skills, finding satisfaction in craftsmanship despite low wages and poor conditions. The church provided rituals and community, festivals broke up the monotony of work, and taverns offered temporary escape and companionship. The Paris of Louis XIV's absolutism was a city of dramatic contrasts, where Baroque magnificence and medieval squalor existed side by side, where the king's glory was built on the backs of people who lived in conditions barely fit for animals. The system was stable in the sense that it persisted, maintained by force, custom, religion, and the sheer difficulty of imagining alternatives when survival consumed all energy. But beneath this stability lay tensions and resentments that would eventually explode when the descendants of these suffering workers would storm the Bastille, overthrow the monarchy, and attempt to create a new order. The Paris of absolutism contained within itself the seeds of revolution, though they would not germinate for another century when the contradictions between proclaimed glory and actual misery became too great to sustain. Through AI reconstruction, we can now see both the splendor that absolutism created and the suffering on which it was built. Understanding this era in its full complexity, and recognizing how the experiences of working people during this period shaped the revolutionary transformation that would eventually sweep away the old order,